Hello and welcome to TaAF Talks, where we share what we're learning to help you create change and make a difference. My name is Jamie Waugh from Together an Active Future, and he's my first, my last, my everything. He's Ken the Magic Man Matter.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of our podcast.
Yes, I don't know if you noticed there, but you got two little cherries there in your introduction, and one of them was the Sky Sports nickname generator. And here's a freebie, everybody. If you go on Google and do Sky Sports darts nickname, and you put people's name in, it generates a nickname.
Oh.
So you came up as Ken Magic Man Matter.
Well, I like that.
You were pretty good. I came up as Jamie the Woolly Mammoth Waugh.
Not so good.
Not so good. So enough of that nonsense. Let's get into it. What we're talking about today are, as you'll know hopefully from a podcast 1 or 2 episodes ago, TaAF have a model for change, and within that we have 3 pillars. And they are test.
Behaviours, systems and places.
Well done, Ken, you passed the test. And so what we're going to do is today and for the next 2 podcasts, they're going to be dedicated to us giving a little bit more on each of those things. Explain why they are a pillar of the, or one of the 3 pillars in our model. Share a bit of context for each one. Share some examples, both good and bad, in how they've kind of worked for TaAF. And maybe give people some ideas on how they potentially could apply some of those things in the places that they work.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to be doing today, and today is about behaviours.
Yeah.
So let's just do a bit of a context setting for it, Ken, and I'll kind of pose this to you firstly. So explain how behaviour kind of relates to the TaAF model for change and why it's kind of in there as we've shown it.
Yeah, so I think when we start, if we go back to the beginning, I suppose, just the beginning of the project, not like the beginning of all time.
Yeah. In the beginning, God created, yes.
But in the beginning of TaAF, I think we soon realised, or we started to formulate at least this idea, that when you talk about systems, particularly place-based kind of public sector systems, there's not a thing, like it's an intangible sort of construct that we've given a name to something to try and describe it, but the reality is that across most elements of the system, it's about people who make decisions and behave in a certain way. And if you want to change the way that things interact and the decisions that people make and the priorities that are set within a system context, ultimately when you boil that all down, it's quite simple and it's about people who behave in a different way.
And sorry, just to interject, I think it's an important thing to just pause and just ask people to think about that a little bit. Because like you say, when you describe a system, you're almost creating this impenetrable thing that can't be worked out and can't be kind of bartered with.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's not a real thing. And in reality, if you think about us, it's Jane and it's Mohammed and it's Tom. A big part of this system, then it's something that I can understand and perhaps understand a bit more and interact with potentially.
And I think when we think about the forces that are within a system, the pressures, the financial elements, whatever else, I think they're easier to understand and kind of organise in our minds when we think about the pressures that decision maker Jane has on her in terms of her decision making. So I think that's that really is where we began, and then over time, through all the work we've done in a variety of projects across lots of different places and work streams within PennI, increasingly behaviours have become a central part of our work and our understanding why things are the way they are and how they might be able to change. And so when we developed our model of places, behaviours and systems, it was one of those 3, but over the last 6 to 12 months as we've started to really figure out how we can articulate our approach to change, that behaviours has become this central element that everything else kind of orbits around.
Yeah. And
if we can figure out a way to help people change their own behaviour, and we'll come on to a minute kind of what behaviours has a number of elements to it, but if we can help people to change behaviour, you know, changing people will change the system.
Absolutely, and like you say, it's what moved it away from being one of the 3. And I think there's a visual on our website that I think we linked to in our last podcast or the one before, where actually the visual we've created is almost like an orbit.
Yeah.
And that's because as we were talking through the creation of that, and as I know you were working on that, we almost said behaviours is kind of fundamental to everything.
Yeah.
You can't do the systems work without thinking of behaviours. You can't do the place-based work without thinking of behaviours.
Absolutely.
and so it became like a really nice almost sun with the other things kind of orbiting around it. It's very pretty.
Yes, nice colours. Behaviours is blue. And there's probably something in that. There'll be someone listening who thinks, oh, blue behaviours.
Blue, yeah, bad choice of colours, TaAF, very poor. So I think the key bit just from that little bit there is think about as behaviours as integral to system change. And system change is just people who make decisions based on behaviours.
The one, and a final thought to add on there, I'm sorry, I know you were trying to wrap that up there.
That's okay.
I think a lot of other people within this world of sort of system change, when we talk about behaviours, I think a lot of people are talking about leadership, and I think that there's a lot of interconnectedness and a lot of overlap between the kind of concepts that we're talking about there. And leadership is a tricky word, and we've kind of settled with behaviours being more universal and more inclusive, but I think a lot of the similar, we're talking about a lot of the similar things. So I know Great Manchester are doing a lot of leadership work and leadership workshops and things like that, covering many of the same types of behaviours that we think are important too.
Yeah, okay, brilliant, thank you. So let's just kind of pose a little bit maybe and try to explain at least our understanding of behaviours. So when you talk about behaviours, by the nature of that, what you're talking about is actually usually quite potentially a mix of ingredients that kind of create behaviours, and potentially complex stuff you need to think about. For TaAF, it would have been easier to just chuck on some projects, do some good work out there, because behaviours starts to start dealing with stuff that's not quite as tangible, not quite as easy to get your head around. And why do you think that is? So share some thoughts really on for you, almost break down behaviours if you like, in a way that we can understand and start to work with.
I think there's a lot of things that influence the way that we behave, and I have a lot of interest in psychology and did a psychology degree, and it's there's a whole science behind the behaviour and thinking of humans. But in our context, things like what do I believe is important? What do I think is valuable? Perhaps in relation to other things. What are the assumptions or taught or learned behaviours where they're influencing now the decisions that I make or what I think is important. And so in everything that we do, there's all this other stuff underneath that's informing then the decisions that we make, or the way that we interact with another person, including our perception of them and their power, their importance, their weaknesses, their influence. There's so much involved in it. And I think it particularly in things like councils and the NHS, there's also like a lot of learned behaviour of this is just the way we do things.
Yeah.
This is just what we do. This is just the process that we follow. And we become almost, one of the things that we enjoy about this work is sitting down and saying, well, what if you didn't?
Yeah.
What if you just didn't do what you've always done?
If for everybody listening, that is one of the most amazing and freeing and enjoyable questions you can ever pose in any conversation. And what if we just didn't? Because it really does open up a really interesting kind of discussion. And I think actually let's just stick with that a little bit, because as you're kind of speaking, I'm starting thinking about going back to that word system and and the learned behaviour. And like I say, so you could argue that the system as it stands is made up of those people in senior positions who've kind of made decisions at a certain point in time. And then how often is it, and then there are processes and things that are created that then people are expected to just follow. And often in some questions, not encouraged to question, not encouraged to pose different ideas and thoughts. Do you know what I mean? And then so everyone's playing a different part in this system of things being set for us, then people becoming, let's not go into too much detail, but staff inductions. This is how we do things. It needs to be done in this kind of way, and it's quite easy to be kind of caught up in the I'll just follow what's been explained and taught to me, and that's what I'll now do, and I'll pass that on to the next person and pass that on to the next person. And in some ways, and maybe we'll expand a little bit on some kind of things around parents and school and stuff, but almost being taught what to think versus encouraged to think for yourself and think of better ways to do things.
Yeah, and I think there's so much in all of this that is really interesting for me. I think typically our culture, I think in a work context, focuses on problems and weaknesses. So if you think about development plans, for example, or personal development plans or appraisals, it's often like, what do you want to improve on? What areas of weakness do we need to strengthen? we've just started a little bit of work with Gallup around a strengths-based model to behaviour change, which is all about what am I good at, and do I invest more time and energy in enhancing my strengths rather than trying to mitigate my weaknesses. But if you spend a lot of time thinking about my weaknesses, about the challenges within a system, why things are difficult, you can become embedded then in, change takes courage and energy and enthusiasm and a willingness to be open to new things and to ask those hard questions. And so that you have to give of yourself a bit to do that. But our default mindset, I think, within a work context, often in many organisations, is starting from a place of trying to manage risk and mitigate weakness, which isn't really a great platform for leading change, because change is risky and focuses on actually you've got to understand what the weaknesses are, but you're trying to move to a greater position of strength. So I think that's a really interesting part of it as well, just in all those ingrained behaviours that you touched on, all those processes, I think are often, probably not intentionally, but are designed to maintain the status quo, to keep things the same. And to prevent risk and accidents and mistakes and criticism.
And then the danger in that is then that, let's say, you create a culture of follow this process, do it this way. And the more you pass that down and the more that's ingrained, is then what you've got is 2 or 3 generations in a workplace who don't ask a question or pose a different idea or a thought because they've never been encouraged to do so. They don't think that's the right thing to do. Do you know what I mean? And what you end up with then is an organisation that's never going to grow, that's never going to develop, people that won't develop and grow. And inevitably what you then do is you lose really great people who actually think, this isn't for me, thank you very much. I came in with ideas and passion, and I refuse to be kind of dampened.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
And I think you've made a couple of really great points there that are going to connect really nicely into what we'll talk about in a little bit. And courage is a word I'm going to ask people to keep in mind as well, because there's a couple of things I want to talk about later that really kind of gets into the courage part of it. So maybe we won't talk too more, but I think there's maybe touch a little bit on. So there's that work kind of bit, but obviously we can work way into that as well as parents and schooling. And I know we're going to segue into an activity that relates to this a little bit, but there is also that bit of, as a parent, do you ever catch yourself kind of delivering a message or doing a thing that actually, if you pause for thought, you'd be like, I don't believe that anyway. I don't know, you shared an example recently about that. Or you say a thing and you go, that's my dad talking. Do you know what I mean? And it's hard to break this kind of cycle of stuff that's taught to you. In schools, similarly, think of it in this way. And when I try and help Neve with a maths question, we've been told we have to do it this way though, so I can't look at how you do it, Daddy. It's like, well, no, maybe we can expand that and push back a little bit, Neve.
So I think let's move into our little mid-podcast activity. So this is something that you can do with teams or colleagues, and this one's dead easy, and a question to ask people of, share, if you're willing and open, share something that you think is an ingrained or a learned behaviour that you is either funny or quirky, or perhaps you're really proud of, or you're a bit ashamed of. And then you can, as people share those thoughts, you have a bit of fun, you get to know each other better, you're reconnecting with people, but you can also then kind of make this point around, these behaviours or ideals or values are an important part of our ability to lead change. So do you want to go first, or shall I go first?
Well, I've got a couple. I don't know how many of you got. Maybe we could do one each.
I've got 17.
Ken has a lot of really bad ingrained behaviours. So my first one, and again, I was trying to think of like school-based ones and kind of, but actually because I was quite a poor student, I didn't really listen. So I haven't got too many ingrained behaviours from school to a degree. I wasn't rebellious, but I was close to that. But I have got a work one, which is something really silly and simple. But it's that it was ingrained in me really early on, because I did jobs such as working in Argos, working in factories, working on building sites and stuff. Offering a brew to people when you go to make yourself a brew. Okay, so that's just nature and natural for me after starting in these jobs. And so imagine my surprise the very first time I got a job in a certain element of the NHS, where I stood up to make a brew. I said, who'd like a brew? And the response I got from somebody who sat next to me was, we don't do that here. And I just said, I don't quite think I understand what you just said to me. You don't do that. We don't offer to make each other brews. And I just said, well, oh, the lights have just gone off. For as long as I'm in this role, I'll be offering you a brew every time I stand up, just to let you know that. And it's a funny thing, it's ingrained in me, but it's a nice thing, I think, that's ingrained, because actually I think that's a good thing to do, because it shows that you care about people. If a chance for a break, they offer it back to you. That's a nice thing for a team to do. Yeah. So that was a good ingrained behaviour in me that I've then tried to instill in other places. I'm just going to go and wave my arms over there to get the lights back on.
While Jamie's trying to get the lights on for anyone who's watching on YouTube, I'll share what I think is a positivity type one that's come from my dad, and I think my granddad too. This idea of if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late.
Okay.
And that was a catchphrase that rings in my head constantly. And my wife's dad actually very, very similar. So there's a bit of a nevertheless often late. But when I am late, there's a deep sense of guilt.
Yeah, shamefulness inside you. You got to slow it down.
A second one that I think is perhaps less useful. Well, so I can be deliberately and both consciously and unconsciously disagreeable almost all of the time. So in a work setting, I think that's my talent and superpower. In that almost anything that comes up, I'll say, well, what if we thought about this differently? What about this different perspective? How could we change and adapt that? Whereas at home, that can be quite annoying. So if the kids come home and say, did you have a good day at school? And they say, yeah. I say, yeah, but what if you didn't? Why did you? Nothing bad happened. Or the opposite, or whatever it might be. So I find sometimes I'll be sat at the dinner table and Robin will be like, why are you disagreeing with them when you completely agree with what they're saying?
All they asked was, could you pass the salt, Dad?
Yeah. Connie was talking at the tea table the other day about profits on utility companies, and I was trying to explain why they shouldn't have a windfall tax, for example.
A little glimpse into the master world, everybody.
Yeah. And then Robin said, but you do think there should be a windfall tax? I said, yeah, I'm about sharing a different point of view. There you go.
Okay, I like that one. And then so here's another one. So this is a personal one, and this is one I think is an interesting one, because I think it's a good thing in my character, and it's also a nuisance and an annoyance for people. And this is one that's a personal one that's been ingrained in me from my family. So I come from a family of 7 children, 3 brothers, 3 sisters. And so from the very earliest thing I can remember, it's been ingrained in me to try to be the funniest, to have to be the loudest, to be the person who interrupts, to get across the last joke, the final word. And when you've grown up doing that, you then really find it hard to break that. And whilst being funny and kind of, outgoing is quite a helpful thing sometimes in teams. Also if your voice is like unbelievably loud, if you can't let people finish a point because you can't wait to jump in and make a joke at their expense or something, it can become a bit tiresome. And it's something I've actively tried to work on. Just the interrupting of people, just so I'm not robbing them of a chance to share a good idea or a thought.
So is it brothers and sisters who are funny? Or was that who you're trying to
Alex, interrupt me, please. So that's a couple for me anyway.
There you go. And there's more, but let's so that's a little activity that can be interesting and fun, and as I say, gather a bit of insight, but also help you to start to think about behaviours and learn behaviours and entrenched behaviours within the system, and how you might then start to think about how you could tackle some of those.
And I'm an example of 42. That's my age, by the way, not my IQ. Similar. You're never too old to try and break something you've been doing for 10, 30, 20, 30, 40 years. So I'm trying to get better at that kind of interrupting, that kind of my nature is to do that. Because actually you realise that that's not always a good thing, and can often be something that's robbing a chance for a really great discussion.
I heard a story on a podcast this week just on that point.
You listen to other podcasts? Cut me deep.
Where a new prison warden had been appointed and was trying to introduce all these kind of programs to help people change and learn new skills and to help the prisoners to develop. And the governor of wherever, I think it was in America, said, well, leopards don't change their spots. Okay. And the warden said, well, good job, I don't work with leopards. I work with men, and they change every day.
I love it.
So that was a nice little...
I always wish I was one of those people who have an amazing response for some kind of nonsense someone's just said, but it's usually afterwards when I'm not there anymore. I think, I wish I'd said that. Okay, so before, I think we're going to share a few examples that we've got, or maybe a couple at least, but there's one thing I wanted to just kind of jump back to that you touched on, I'd just like to expand on a little bit, and it's that particularly how values can drive behaviour, both almost the positive side of that and potentially the less positive and negative side of that. And so I might round these off and not kind of necessarily click to yourself, Ken, but feel free to jump in. So you can think of values where you think that feels like that's a good value to drive behaviour. So things like honesty and integrity. It's hard to see how they would not lead to good behaviours in a workplace, in a home environment. And there's lots of things like that, and again at home, maybe sit there now thinking about what your personal values are. And then there's also a value that I kind of wrote down here, and this is one that's kind of, I connect with quite a lot, which is the value of popularity or wanting to be liked. Is potentially something that drives a behaviour that maybe isn't quite so good. Because obviously if you have that as a value, and it's understandable, humans kind of want to be liked, but it suggests that you'd probably change your behaviour in such a way so that as to make people like you. And you touched on before that might therefore mean not having the courage to offer a different perspective or not having the courage to disagree, because disagreeableness often won't lead to you being popular for that initial part of the conversation. And so I think there's just something to kind of think about around thinking about your own values or values you see in others and whether or not their actions reflect that, and how you can at least think about your own and make sure, what is it I value and is that demonstrated in the actions that I take?
And the first part of change is, understanding self as well, and being really open and honest with yourself about what drives your behaviour, positively and negatively. Your pitfalls, your desire for acceptance, your parental upbringing, your religious beliefs, and it's not saying any of those things should change or are good or are bad, but it's important to be aware of them.
Yeah, and I think, but what is great about all of those things is, but they can change, and everybody is a living example of how they can change, and we'll maybe touch on a couple of examples now of where we've kind of seen that a little bit. So here's some examples of where we've kind of seen or helped or kind of really strongly influenced kind of behaviour change, and touch on maybe what's enabled it. So I've got one. Should we name names? I don't know if we should or not.
Sure.
Yeah, whatever. So we, as you'll know again if you've listened to any of our podcasts, a big part of what we do is creative engagement and everything that entails. And actually, if you think of behaviours, creative engagement for us is almost just a way of demonstrating kind of behaviours and how to do things. And so I've recently done some work with Lancashire FA, because their chief executive, who's called Simon, really, really great guy, and basically he came into Lancashire FA a little while ago and has been keen to assess the culture, the approaches, the behaviours of that organisation, and how can I really ensure this organisation is going in a direction that kind of reflects the values that kind of he's come in and displayed. And so spending my time with him and his teams and stuff, that was just a great example of, firstly, a willingness and an acceptance to think, I think there's some things in our behaviours that we could do better. And maybe we need somebody to come in and give us some kind of outside kind of thoughts or ideas or something, or just create the space for ourselves to have these conversations. And just spending, again, a couple of half days with them, encouraged by leadership that recognises the value in this type of stuff. Because Lancashire FA, historically, because people know them as sometimes the organisation responsible for Sunday FA leagues and fines and referee disputes and all that kind of stuff, it comes with some natural kind of connotations, if you like. So spending some time with them, but what's been really, really lovely is then having members of their team then do emails or video updates to me since to say, here's how some of that creative engagement stuff has changed how I do things now, which you can read in this podcast for how I've changed my behaviour when it comes to work. And one particular person I won't name this person, but she said, because it was a beautiful thing to get, I get quite emotional when I see somebody who's really been changed by something that TaAF have done. The sessions that I was with you, Jamie, since then, almost everything I'm doing now, I'm asking, what is the value for the person in this regard? What is the success for them in what I'm trying to do now? And how is that going to shape what I'm going to do? Which is a massive change in behaviour. It's amazing.
Great. I'll just share one, and then we'll perhaps have time for one more or move on to the final part. But we've been working with a director of communities at one of the councils in Pennine, and this individual has I think, been on a real journey with us about what systems leadership and place-based working really means, against a backdrop of pressures from within the council about how things should be done, or the pace of things that should be done. And just share one thought. We're actually co-presenting at a workshop for leisure trusts, a national kind of conference for leisure trusts, and he talked about some of the work we'd done, and he used the word consultation. It's absolutely perfectly normal word to use. And he stopped himself, said, I've got to stop, because I've learned that there's a big difference between consultation and engagement, and we haven't consulted, we've engaged with communities and started to co-design and develop solutions together. And just that, almost, it was a really kind of a jolting moment of that, seeing the old and the new in the same person at the same time, and his conscious ability or recognition of, actually, no, we're doing something different now, something I've perhaps not done before, but I want to be really clear that it's different from consultation. And in the overall context of what we're saying, probably wasn't a critical point, but actually of the whole presentation, I think that was one of the real light bulb moments for everyone, and just seeing him change in approach and perspective because of his own desire to become better at place-based working, but also from our influence as a project was really nice.
I love that, and I love the fact, like you say, it's, even if it's not a big deal, in his mind it was, and the willingness to go, nope, sorry, because then what everybody else is seeing is somebody's willing to go, do you know what, no, let me just go back over, and you know what I mean, and I love that open acceptance that I'm changing my thinking in this regard now, you know what I mean, and again, that's somebody who's very experienced, been part of a system for a long time, but is changing on a kind of week-to-week basis, which is brilliant. I won't share the other example. Well, actually, I'll just set it up, because we in TaAF, again, if you've listened to a previous podcast, it's funny how these all tie together. It's almost as if we've designed it brilliantly, which we haven't.
Which we haven't. No, it's kind of like, well, on a few days before, we'll say, what should the next one be on? But our work is connected and collaborative and co-designed.
So we operate this shared role as a secondment model, if you like. I'm just hearing an example of one of the leads for one of the TaAF teams in Pennine, Lancashire the other day, kind of came into a TaAF role in the past 6 months, didn't really get it, didn't really necessarily want to be given this role because she'd made some preconceptions about the TaAF, and then just hearing how she's really embraced this mindset of its behaviours and approaches versus projects, and seeing her enthusiasm and passion, and as she's telling me, and this is now how my team have worked since I've introduced this thing, which is all about how we connect and build relationships. And actually, I've just met somebody else from another team, and I can't wait to get into there and help them do the same. You know, and just seeing this ripple of behaviour change that's going to be happening because of somebody's enthusiasm and passion and willingness to go, maybe we can just do something different here, guys. And hopefully a future podcast guest who can share. In fact, maybe all three of those are really good future podcast guests for us. So that people don't have to listen to our ramblings.
Which are good.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. By ramblings, I meant absolutely intellectual, highbrow discussion.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. So here's a thought. So we've talked about behaviours, we've talked about the journey and the learning that we've been getting, and maybe someone's there listening and going, okay, this is an interesting field, I'm interested in it, I don't know much about it. What can they do in the assumption that we are not necessarily the world leading experts in this area?
Yeah. Great question, because I think what's really important if you listen to these podcasts or any kind of personal development learning, you invest some time, it's good to have some takeaways of practical actions I can actually take. So I just listed down a few thoughts here. So the Local Government Association in partnership with Sport England run a really great course that we're part of that's called Leadership Essentials, which talks about systems, leadership and behaviours, and loads of really good stuff in that. So that might be something to explore and see if you can be part of. We've got other podcasts, mostly about practical applications of behaviours, things like creative engagement and others.
Yeah, relationship building and that kind of stuff, shared role and how that can influence behaviours in teams.
So check out the other Together and Active Future podcasts on those various topics. If you search on the Sport England website for local delivery pilots, they've released in the last 12 or 18 months a whole series of documents and reports and guides on leading systems and place-based change, and there's loads of really good ideas about shifting behaviours kind of old to new leadership and different practical tips that you can learn there. And then one of the things that we've really enjoyed individually is reading great books on the topics, and you've got a couple that you've enjoyed recently, that'll be.
Yeah, and I've tried to capture these with like a sentence to explain it. I'll do a bad job, but I'll name check 3, and I think all 3 of these are connected to what we talked about. So I'll be careful with the first one. The first one is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F, expletive, and that's by Mark Manson. I really enjoyed that one, just read it recently, and there's a lot of that is around accepting responsibility for your problems, and then recognising that how you control and interpret and put responses to what happens to you. So really about that kind of personal responsibility for what happens, and how you choose to act on that is the thing that determines what happens. I love the name of this one, The Art of Being Brilliant. So a lot of that is about how you can choose to be positive, the top 2%ers, as they say, because as we kind of alluded to earlier, the nature of humans is to be a little bit focused on the risk, on the negative, on the work stuff. So there's a lot in there about people can be negative, humans like to fit in, but here's how you can choose to be different, to be positive. And again, how most of what happens to you in your life is not decided by what happens, but how you choose to respond to what happens. And then the last one is something I read a little while ago on a reread soon. It's called The Courage to be Disliked. And that is, the idea that freedom is...
It's really important for you.
Well, I need it just to be able to explain away the reality of my own popularity. is almost how freedom is ultimately being disliked by people, because it's a sign you're living in accordance with your own values and your own freedoms, as opposed to behaving in a way that makes you fit in. So all 3 of these I would encourage. They're not big reads. I think all 3 of them have really shifted to some degree my behaviours and actions in the past few years.
And I've enjoyed Atomic Habits by James Clear, which is kind of really starting to establish habits based on your values rather than your desired outcomes. So that's really interesting. And an oldie but a goodie, Stephen R. Covey book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, has some really interesting stuff there about how you embrace personal values in order to lead and be effective. And
so any of them, there's some there are probably
thousands of others. Right?
Yeah, and some there are probably more kind of professional orientated, some are more kind of personal, some have got lots of swearing in them. One of them's told in a kind of a master and student conversation dialogue situation. So check them out, pick one, have a read and make a start, because I think they're all absolutely brilliant. So here's another thought we could do. If you were going to pose a question to people, something they could ask themselves that might help them get on this kind of behaviour change evolution, what would that be?
So I thought of lots. I think one of the things that I've found useful to really spend some time thinking about, we talk in TaAF a lot about giving yourself time to think. What type of person do I actually want to be, irrespective of who you are? And it talks about this a little bit in a topic, habits, about voting, these votes for the person who you want to become.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good place to start. How do I want to behave, almost irrespective of the context. We're quite chameleon-ish in our behaviour sometimes, as we adapt to situations. That's good, but if we can start to think about who do I want to be in terms of the way that I behave, that might be a good starting place.
And I like that one with James Clear one. He'd like to say, and then every action you take towards that is a vote for you being that person. I think it's a really great way to think about it. And here's one for me, I think alluding to those books I've been reading, which is, how much better could this be if I accepted my own personal responsibility to make it happen? A big bugbear of mine is people leave a conversation and then complain about how the conversation went afterwards, as opposed to have the courage to say, how could I have influenced that to be a different thing? And you can apply that to all different walks of life. So there are 2 questions. Pose them for yourselves, have a little think, and see if you start to make changes in your own behaviour. So let's do a wrap up, Ken. So we're not going to do a final thought, but we're going to do this kind of posing of, we've talked about lots of things here. Hopefully all of it has gone in and everyone's a fundamentally different person now. But if some of them, like me and like you, have massively short attention spans, if you remember nothing else from what we've said today, what would you kind of get across? If you remember nothing else, remember this.
Good question. I'm just trying to reflect on all the things that we've talked about today. I think takeaway thought is your greatest asset for leading change or for helping to support change is you. It's who you are and the way that you behave and interact with others.
Okay, lovely. And then I'll have one, because you know what I mean. The two of us, and we compete otherwise, so we'll have to have one each. I'll go for reflect on your values, and then ask yourself, what actions do I take that reflect my values? Okay, brilliant. So we'll wrap up there. As always, please check us out on Twitter at TaAF Talks. We have a website which is taaf.co.uk. We've got a newsletter and stuff like that. We've got previous podcasts. We've got some good future podcasts lined up. We have one ask of you. Well, we've got lots of ask of you. We told you to ask yourself all these questions and reflect on all sorts. But here's another. If you've enjoyed this, if you think this has been of value, please share it on with others. Because it would be great to think that we're able to kind of help people in this regard. And if it hasn't been helpful, then drop us a line. Let us know what we could do differently to really make a difference for you. Because we're up for changing our behaviour when it's in line with the values and what we're trying to achieve. Awesome. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Cheerio.